inequality measures are notoriously unreliable. Oxfam ought to be working with business. It's business that ultimately generates the things which Oxfam have to redistribute: the food, the water, the chemicals, the pharmaceuticals, and so forth. If you then deregulate, you're letting in competition. So often the defenders of regulation are actually incumbent firms.
Hello and welcome to the IEA YouTube channel. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Officer and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Oxfam have recently published their report Inequality Inc, How Corporate Power Divides Our World and the Need for a New Era of Public Action. So, in order to solve global inequality, Oxfam's recommendations include a 60% tax on income from stocks and shares, global minimum wealth tax, permanent taxation of excess profits, a permanent taxation on global minimum corporation tax at least 25%, and the nationalisation of energy, transport, health and education. So, to discuss Oxfam's report, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Len Shackleton. Len is a Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham, and he is also the IEA's Editorial and Research Fellow. Len, thank you so much for joining me today. So, first of all, can we talk a little bit about the sort of background behind this report? I know you've written about it before. What is it? What is a series of reports that Oxfam actually publishes?
Okay, well, these reports are published as a counterpoint to the Davos World Economic Forum, which is held every year in January, and each year they write about the issue of inequality in the world and the way in which we ought to confront this by radical changes in the way in which we organise society. And they've been doing this now since, I'm not quite sure when this started, but I first wrote about it, I think, in 2014, so that's 10 years ago. And each year they produce a kind of new wrinkle on it. During COVID, for example, it was about the inequality which COVID was throwing up. This year it's about how 5 billionaires have hoovered up huge increases in their wealth during a period when living standards may have been falling for a lot of people.
That's really interesting. So it's they sort of talk about the way in which inequality has worsened. There's even, I think, a foreword by Bernie Sanders in this report this year. And the main focus is this idea that inequality has worsened. Is this true?
Well, inequality measures are notoriously unreliable. They fluctuate a great deal. When they focus on wealth, of course, this is a rather misleading thing because wealth is a will o' the wisp. Wealth is really people's or the market's valuation of future earnings. And so when they say a company is worth X billion pounds, that's because people think that it's going to be producing flows of income in the future. And of course, when something changes to alter that expectation, then the wealth plummets. And I mean, the classic example of this, which is worth quoting, I think, is Elon Musk, who, when he took over Facebook and all this sort of stuff, the market's valuation of his wealth collapsed. In the space of, I think, 14 months, he lost $182 billion, right? Because the value of his wealth fell. So wealth is a very difficult thing to measure. And we don't have any even national statistics on wealth, let alone global statistics. So there's a lot of fancy methodology in here in trying to make up numbers which tell a story. And that's what Oxfam is actually very good at, telling stories. But sometimes these stories can be rather misleading.
So with the methodology and the way in which they've sort of framed this inequality, they've effectively said that the top 5 richest people in the world are getting richer and that within the next 20 or 30 years there will be a trillionaire. And they talk about this as being a very, very bad thing, that it proves that the world is getting worse, that actually things are getting worse, and actually that inequality is worsening as well. I mean, is this true, and how are they sort of framing that?
The whole approach really it could be described as Marxist. I'm not suggesting that the people involved are Stalinists or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But essentially, their view is that there is, if you like, a pot of wealth, and if the rich get more of it, then the poor get less, a kind of immiserization idea. And this really does go back to sort of Marxist economics, whereas I think mainstream economics would argue that wealth isn't created by, wealth has to be created by people cooperating through a market process to generate value. It's not something which you can just take a lump of something and give it to somebody else. There are elements in wealth which could be redistributed, but there'd be a rather difficult thing to do. Luxury yachts, for example, what would you do with them? Could we all have a share of a luxury yacht for 10 minutes or something? But I say most of the wealth of these seriously rich people is in terms of financial assets, and financial assets can, as I was saying before, collapse in value. And if you try to redistribute this wealth, it just falls apart because the process which has generated wealth is undermined by massive redistribution and taking away the incentives to create wealth in the first place. So it's a very naive approach, actually. It's a sort of 19th century approach to wealth generation. Which I think, it does worry me. I mean, Oxfam, let's be positive about Oxfam. It was created in 1942 in Oxford to create help in famines, and it's done a terrific job over many, many decades. That's not the issue. The issue is whether the sort of confrontational approach of a succession of Oxfam executives is actually the best approach. Now, they're just appointing a lady called Halima Begum, who is a very well-known figure in the third sector and has also worked in government. But, this kind of confrontational stuff, she has no experience of business whatsoever. Oxfam ought to be working with business. It's business that ultimately generates the things which Oxfam have to redistribute: the food, the water, the chemicals, the pharmaceuticals, and so forth. Working with business will be a much more positive approach than this. It's a dreadful capitalist conspiracy. We've got to pull it all down and start again.
I think it's interesting because the report highlights this idea behind corporate greed, and actually that it's these large corporations. One of the titles in one of the chapters was about big pharma, big tech, big everything, and this idea that these large corporations are sort of sucking in or hoovering in all of our wealth. And I think, this comes back to a wider conversation about inequality and a wider conversation about wealth creation. How is wealth created? Is it through governments? Is it through corporations? Is it through trade? Can we talk a little bit about how wealth is actually created in the first place?
Well, it's not created by government. Government it's necessary for there to be a government. And indeed, many of the countries in which Oxfam operates are characterised by very poor government, very poor governance, corruption and so forth. And one of the advantages actually of using Oxfam and other charities rather than our government directly intervening is that charities are often better on the ground, they work on a smaller scale, they deal with people on a personal basis and so forth. So, that is a reasonable kind of approach. But where the wealth comes from, as I was saying before, it's about providing incentives for people to generate wealth through exchange, through creating value and so on. It's not through government sort of taking things from one group of people, giving it to another and saying this improves matters. That doesn't improve matters.
The wealth has to be created in the first place for you to even redistribute it in that moment as well. I think, sort of talking about this, I think sort of zooming out a little bit about this wider conversation regarding inequality. Inequality itself is discussed as a sort of buzzword, and it's sort of discussed in the media in that way. Obviously, Oxfam have highlighted it in their report. And this sort of reminds me of, I think it was one of Margaret Thatcher's pretty famous speeches where she talks about the fact that the socialists would rather the poor be poorer so long as the rich were less rich. Why is there this aversion to wealth? Why is there this sort of idea that the top 5 richest people becoming wealthier is a bad thing? I mean, why do we talk about wealth so negatively?
Wealth, there have always been criticisms of rich people. It's been associated with religion very often, with the idea that the riches of this world are transitory and there are more important things, and that's true enough. Our families, our friends, our private lives, and so on are much more important than possessions. But nevertheless, acquiring possessions and creating goods and services which benefit society is a very positive thing. And people need some kind of balance in this. That yes, we may need some redistribution to help people who are genuinely distressed, or there are social problems which need assistance and so forth. But that's a very different thing from saying inequality in itself is a bad thing. Inequality necessarily arises in any kind of complex society. I mean, if you take something like wealth, which Oxfam loves to focus on, wealth is obviously associated with something as simple as age, something as human as age. When I started out, my first work after university, I had no wealth at all.
It's me right now.
Well, exactly, of course it is. But realistically, over time, your wealth will accumulate. You will be richer than your equivalent in 30 years' time. And this is a natural process. Inequality can perhaps go too far, but the inequality itself is not a bad thing. It's a necessary consequence of the way in which we live our lives.
And I suppose inequality is a sort of prerequisite to the fact that individuals live different lives and behave in different ways, and within a market economy will be trading in different ways and also interacting with one another, cooperating with one another in different ways. Inequality itself, I suppose, is evidence of individuality in some ways. What's interesting to me about this sort of framing of economics as sort of this focus on inequality, it doesn't necessarily talk about the fact that, for example, since the 1990s, there are a billion or so less people living below the poverty line than in the 1990s compared to now. But of course, the Oxfam report doesn't highlight this fact at all, and instead focuses on the fact that the wealthiest are getting wealthier, rather than the fact that at the same time, there are significantly less people living in poverty now than there were, say, 30 years ago.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There has been a tendency on the left, but also in mainstream sociology and economics, to confuse poverty and inequality. And indeed, our official measures of poverty are actually measures of inequality. And this is very interesting because when people first got interested in looking at poverty systematically in the late 19th century, people like Booth, people like Seaborn Rowntree, they focused on minimum standards which were necessary. Seaborn Rowntree went around York in the first decade of the 20th century, knocking on doors, noting down what sort of lifestyle people have. And he drew up a kind of measure of poverty based on what was necessary to lead a reasonable subsistence life, actually. Later in his career, by 1950, that type of poverty virtually vanished from York. And in the 50s and 60s, sociologists turned their attention to relative poverty. And the idea was that poverty was no longer a thing about not having enough to eat, heating, light, all that kind of stuff. It was now about how you related to the rest of the society. And so the poverty line became things like 60% of median household income. If you fell below that, you were poor. even though by historic standards or by standards comparing you with the rest of the world, then you were living the life of Riley, right? But so the whole story had changed about that, and this is true in Oxfam as well. And what concerns me is that Oxfam really is concerned with the old type of poverty. There's a lot of people in countries which Oxfam deals with who are really in that pre-Seaborn Roundtree type definition of poverty, and yet the focus of a lot of this stuff which Oxfam writes is actually about inequality. It's nothing to do with this poverty level.
I think it's interesting because it's the demonisation of wealthy people, sort of blaming global capitalism, blaming large corporations, blaming wealthy, successful business people that have contributed, created value, and people have seen value in that, and that's why they've created this wealth. Demonising those people and blaming them for global poverty, blaming them for people living below that poverty line. And I think, I suppose my question is, why is that shift towards those people rather than focusing on actually what creates wealth in the first place, and that is cooperation and free trade?
Yeah, well, the rich are out there. We can see them. The gossip columns and so forth. Twitter's full of this stuff, right?
Elon Musk's of the world.
Exactly. These people are prominent, and they're often silly people. They're often self-obsessed, narcissistic people. They're easy to dislike.
Right.
But that, they are the flotsam and jetsam of the market process. There are people who end up who you think you wouldn't really want to give the time of day to, who are very rich. But that's not the point. The point is that the system which generates wealth benefits all of us. And when we start to pull it down, some of the measures which are being proposed by Oxfam in this latest paper are quite frankly laughable. They would actually wreck any economy where they apply. But of course, Oxfam's playing safe here because no government in isolation could actually bring in these things. So you'd have to have a world government or something to impose a minimum level of tax and all this kind of stuff.
Some of them, they are actually calling for that. Let's talk about those specific recommendations. They've said a 60% tax on income from stock, shares, rent and other revenue that the rich disproportionately rely on. A global minimum
actually,
wealth tax.
we often rely on, for our pension funds and things like this. This is, it's company shares and other financial assets which generate the pensions which many of us enjoy.
So effectively, a 60% tax, what effect would that have on those pension funds, on those investment portfolios?
Well, it would mean, in order for you, Reem, think about it, you will be old sometime, I'm sure. You don't think about that much, but it creeps up on you very quickly. And you do need to save, you do need a pension. And clearly, if financial assets are being taxed at such a very high rate like that, it would mean you would have to save vastly more in order to generate a comfortable living standard in retirement. You think you've got it harsh now, but the amount you would have to save in order to generate a reasonable living standard would shoot through the roof. And
I suppose their argument would be, well, that 60% tax will go towards positive amounts of public spending. But again, this is where there is the lack of accountability. It's effectively saying that we must trust governments to handle our money better than we can handle it ourselves. And when we're taxing these assets at such high levels, if this sort of, I think even Corbyn would cringe at some of these proposals. Looking at these kind of huge amounts of taxes that would actually discourage investment and discourage wealth creation. But it's about trusting. We must trust governments to handle their money for us.
They call for nationalisation of a whole range of businesses.
Energy, transport, health, education.
Yeah.
And this trust that governments can somehow handle things better than we can.
But, Oxfam's own existence rather provides a critique of that view. Somewhere in there they also say that governments should cut out outsourcing, right? Outsourcing to the private sector, and yet, about a third to 40% of Oxfam's income comes precisely from government outsourcing. that they're doing things for the government, which they get a big chunk of their income from, because the government can't do it for itself. And this is a thing which so many people on the left have had this blind faith in government, when we know day in, day out, the post office scandal, all this sort of stuff hits us every day. Governments can't do things very well. They need to focus on what they can do and what they have to do, like defence and basic support of welfare support and so forth, rather than this whole range of things which Oxfam want to see it doing.
And I suppose that's not to say that businesses don't make mistakes, but the difference,
the
difference is that we're forced to give our money to governments, whereas we can voluntarily stop giving our money to private businesses. I also just want to talk about this idea behind a global minimum corporation tax of at least 25%. So, in the UK, we've increased corporation tax 25% at the, not the last budget, I think the budget before. And again, increasing it from 19% meant that it was driving out investment, especially when you've got Ireland next door, who have a 12.5% corporation tax rate, half of what we have. It means that companies like AstraZeneca have left the UK for some of their investment projects. I think it was something like a £450 million investment project that they moved to Ireland purely due to that corporation tax rate increase. So what would happen if we suddenly said, okay, a quarter of all, we must have 25% corporation tax rate across the world? Where would they go? What would happen? What effect would that have on investment?
Well, of course, a whole bunch of countries have signed up to a minimum of 15% corporation tax, something which I think was foolish.
And they've now increased that recommendation to 25%.
The thing is that people, non-economists, have no understanding of corporation tax. They think it's paid in some mysterious way by business. It's not. It's paid by individuals, and it falls partly on shareholders. People are right to point that out. But econometric work on this suggests that a very large part of it actually falls on consumers through higher prices, and perhaps something people don't understand at all, it falls on workers. And there is, because if the amount you can get after tax is reduced, you've got to cut costs somewhere, and where you cut costs falls on pay more often than not. And this has led actually economists like Joseph Stiglitz, who's impeccably left-wing economist, right? Nobel Prize winner, interesting guy. I don't agree with him on most things, but he's absolutely right on this. He thinks corporation tax should be abolished because it does not do what it says on the tin. It doesn't tax the people who he wants taxing. The tax falls on smaller people,
on the workers and the consumers.
On the workers and the consumers.
I think that's really interesting. The way that the framing of corporation tax itself, saying that actually we're going to tax all corporations at 25%, but the impact of that on consumers and workers aren't highlighted at all. It is. It's a relatively simplistic, and there are other recommendations that we don't have to go into, but it's a relatively simplistic sort of perspective. It's effectively, Oxfam effectively said in this report, inequality has increased because richer people are getting richer, and so what we need to do is take away all of their money. But they want governments to do that. They want governments to take away those financial assets from those people, and they want to redistribute it. The impact, but I don't think necessarily that the concept that actually if you were to tax those people even more, if you were to tax corporations more, there would be less wealth to redistribute it in itself. Why can't they see that? Why isn't this kind of perspective sort of shown?
Economics is a very difficult subject to understand. It's a remarkably easy subject in many ways, but it requires common sense, and common sense is anything but common. Particularly amongst people who've got to be in their bonnet about, the world is not the way we would like it to be. It's very easy to go for these simplistic solutions. I think it's terrible that an organisation of the size of Oxfam and the reputation of Oxfam doesn't have some decent economists in there. and it doesn't have a leadership which understands business, understands economics. It may well have experts in digging wells or other useful functions like that, but it doesn't seem to have anybody with an ounce of common sense to talk about the economy and to talk about the role of business in the economy.
I think that's interesting. I just want to read a quote from the Oxfam's International Interim Executive Director, who said that governments must intervene to break up monopolies, empower workers, tax these massive corporate profits, and crucially, invest in a new era of public goods and services. Now, the reason why I highlight this quote is because they talk in the report. They talk about monopolies, and they talk about the role of big tech or big pharma or big everything. I think is the quote from the report itself. This idea behind rent seeking isn't necessarily highlighted, and actually, I think what's interesting is it talks about the fact that all these corporations have all this power, and yet they want to give government more power to then allow those corporations to lobby for special privileges. So why isn't this concept of rent seeking ever really discussed in these conversations about the role of government?
Well, that requires a slightly more sophisticated economic understanding and clearly is manifested in Oxfam's successive reports. I mean, there are problems with large organisations and monopoly power and so forth, but I think they can be exaggerated. It's certainly true that at any particular time there will be organisations, corporations which dominate a particular market. But if you look over time, 10 or 20 years, what you get is technological change which undermines monopolies. And one of the problems with government interfering to try to deal with monopolies is they may actually protect. It sounds bizarre, but by regulating something, you actually set up barriers to entry for new organisations which might come in and do things more cheaply, more effectively.
It's more difficult for them to, I suppose, absorb those regulatory costs. If you're, for example, take digital markets regulation, and you've got these large, big corporations that have huge monopoly power, and if you're a little old small company that wants to enter the market, you've got to face all of these huge regulatory costs. But if you're a larger corporation, you're used to it. You've been regulated in that way in the past, and actually absorbing those regulatory costs isn't as much of a burden as it is for a little old company that wants to compete with the big guys. So I think it's interesting with this concept of regulation. Could you tell me a bit about why those regulations actually mean that those companies can't enter the market or find it difficult, those barriers to entry?
We're perhaps getting a little off track here, but yes, regulation, it's a burden on businesses, but incumbent businesses have to take it on board. They incur the costs of doing this. And new entrants, of course, will also have to acquire the costs. Now, we often hear arguments for deregulation, and you might think that every firm would want to go for deregulation. But this isn't the case. If you're an incumbent and you've already internalised the costs of regulation, then this is just a cost like any other business cost. And if you then deregulate, you're letting in competition. So often the defenders of regulation are actually incumbent firms. This doesn't mean that regulation is a good thing. It means that you've got to look very carefully at who is making the argument.
It's interesting, it's the irony behind this report. One of the recommendations is further regulation of these large monopolistic companies, but actually, in many ways, those regulations actually may protect their monopolistic power. So I think finally, I just want to touch on this idea behind the way in which Oxfam have spoken about government regulation and government intervention itself. The International Interim Executive Director saying governments must intervene. Would you say that if Oxfam were to work with business instead, or work alongside business, work to promote entrepreneurship, that would have a more positive impact on what they want to solve, which is global poverty?
I think certainly the working with business would provide a different source of income. It would make them less dependent on lobbying the state, which is what they devote quite a lot of resource to doing, not just Oxfam, but many other charities. It would a more direct connection with people rather than with governments, I think, is something which they should pursue.
Absolutely, I have to say I agree with you, Len. Len, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss Oxfam's report, and thank you all for watching and listening. If you enjoyed this video or you would like to listen on the IEA's podcast, you can have a look and listen on your chosen podcast app. And if you enjoyed and you're watching on the YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button, like and comment so you can enjoy more of our videos. Thank you.